Good day from Inside Drug Discovery. This is a reaction video to a recent video put out by the FDA. Now, the FDA recently announced this idea of real-time clinical trials and that they're actually being implemented. And they did a press release on this, and I did a reaction video to that. But then right afterwards, they released another video, which was kind of a more casual conversation with some of the members of the press conference who are on the stage. And I thought it was interesting and worth sharing. So let's go ahead and jump into this sort of intimate conversation about real-time clinical trials. All right, here we are in the video. I'm going to stay down in this bottom corner. I might obscure a couple graphics, but I'll try to call those out if I'm getting in the way. So here we go.
He's good. Bigfoot's good. We're good. And so we're going to do this. That's actually his name, Bigfoot.
He exists.
People don't think he exists, but you've met him.
Yeah. Bigfoot is a running gag. He's one of the production team, the AV folks there at FDA.
Someday we'll get him more on camera. I think people have seen his hand, like the actual Bigfoot. So I'm here with FDA's Chief AI Officer, Jeremy Walsh. We had a big announcement today, and we're thrilled to have with us two doctors that we love, Dr. Emma Meagher from the University of Pennsylvania. She's Professor of Medicine and Pharmacology and also the Vice Dean for Clinical Research and Translational Research. And Dr. Jennifer Litton, Chief Clinical Research Officer at MD Anderson Cancer Center. If you have not heard of the University of Pennsylvania or MD Anderson Cancer Center, let me tell you a little bit about them. They are small, up-and-coming institutions in the healthcare system.
So Commissioner Makary, a little bit of a prankster gangster. You know, he's got a little bit of wit in there. So around this table we have Jeremy Walsh. He's on the left. He's the AI officer. He's kind of stitching handles all the data networking. Commissioner Marty Makary. In the red, we have Jennifer Litton from MD Anderson. And on the far right is Emma Meagher, which is not a pronunciation I would have gotten. I hope the commissioner got that right. Emma Meagher from UPenn, one of their top clinical trial folks.
Great to have you here, and thanks for joining us. Exciting day.
Yeah, very exciting day.
It was a great day. I mean, I can't thank you both enough for taking the time to come to the FDA. Listening to both of your sort of stories was just had left such an impression on me in terms of the work that you do every day. You know, taking care of patients, trying to drive. You know, both on the drug development side, on the sort of the cancer delivery side, cancer sort of patient side. So I think it was really just a profound experience to sort of listen to that.
Why don't you say?
So, you know, this is kind of an after party after the press conference. And it looks like only the cool kids invited. That, you know, the major pharma reps are not present. So, you know, I'd like everybody to be at the table, but that's okay, because this is a nice casual, not totally casual, but relatively casual conversation.
We just got from the announcement, so maybe you can share a little bit about what it was.
What's been happening is that over time, the FDA receives more and more information, right? You've got your phase 1 trials, your phase 2 trials, your phase 3 trials. And so as part of that process, you enroll as a patient, you go into a site, your data is being collected. It's being, as you mentioned, sort of being transformed into multiple different systems, which is then sort of cleaned, right? You know, looked at, analyzed, cleaned, locked, and then eventually sort of sent to the FDA, right? This takes time, right?
I think there's an implication in there. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but the data are cleaned. So that's, you know, and I don't doubt that's the case. I don't know. I have never handled clinical trial data. But, you know, cleaning data doesn't have maybe the most pleasant nuance.
And it's costly and it's time consuming. And also actually kind of a little bit prone to error in some scenarios as well, right? So there's a lot of stuff that happens within that process. And so what the FDA is sitting here is saying, how can we reimagine that? You know, and really it comes down to the sort of the thought process is, what data do we need to make a decision? What information does the FDA truly need in order to make a regulatory decision, especially in your early phase 1 and phase 2 trials, right? Like where we mostly focus around the safety side. So I think today was...
Okay. Phase one may mostly focus on safety, at least from a regulatory standpoint. Phase two, definitely also about efficacy. That's it's the first time dosing and monitoring the therapeutic benefit in humans.
It's an announcement around that. We have launched real-time clinical trials. We are looking at we're starting from a standpoint of the least amount of information as possible, signal data, right? Any type of signal the FDA defines as part of this trial, industry will be analyzing, and then they'll be sending that us in real time, and then our reviewers are going to be looking at that. And so that's the beauty of what we're doing. We're almost kind of resetting the clock a little bit, restarting the conversation around. We know you can send us everything. Let's start with what we need. So I think that's kind of was the announcement today.
Great. So today the FDA announced the first ever real-time clinical trial. This is not a theoretical. It's not an idea. It's not a panel to discuss the future possibility. It's not an expression of intent. It is live. It is up and running. Your centers are participating. And so it's exciting. Tell us a little bit about it. If you could start, Emma.
Just really excited about the idea that the FDA is focusing on process innovation. It's long overdue for all of us to actually focus on that. On a very practical level in the trenches, you know this, the amount of time that you spend entering information into systems, and there's no shortage of them, is lost time.
It's mind-numbing.
Mind-numbing. And
I don't see how real-time clinical trials are going to reduce the amount of time entering data. Now the FDA may see not everything, but I'm guessing there's still a heck of a lot of data that's just unclear to me. Why is less data being collected for these real-time clinical trials?
it's actually mind-numbing for the people who do it. Mm-hmm. So much so that it's really hard to keep them in their jobs. Yeah, they're not terribly well-paying jobs to begin with, and
I mean, there you go. You can't keep people in their jobs, and then you admit that they're not well-paying jobs. If someone's providing value, they should be compensated for providing value. It's not hard to understand.
It's boring, repetitive work, and it is prone to error, no question. And then it gets analyzed by the docs who are in the fields doing the trials, and then it gets transmitted to the company, who then analyze the information. And it's kind of redundancy and repetitiveness that isn't necessary. So this concept has the real potential of being transformative.
You know, the analysis, multiple people analyze the data, but that doesn't make it repetitive. The physicians in the clinic are going to look for certain signals, but the scientists in pharma, they've seen all the animal safety data. They're going to be tuned into some other things that the physicians won't have. So I don't think it's duplicative. It may be time consuming, and maybe that can be made more efficient. I don't argue about that, but it's not necessarily just duplicated, wasted effort.
I think that if we do this truly as a partnership, and I said this earlier today, 20 years ago, the FDA was a regulatory body. Today, the FDA has a position that it wants to partner on solutions, and that in and of itself is transformative. So for academia to partner with industry and the FDA in an innovative approach to actually accelerate this incredibly painful process, it can be a game changer. Really can. We need to do it right. We need to do it in a sustained fashion, but it can be a game changer.
I would like to see. I think she's very enthusiastic about this. You know, I mean, everybody is, but I think she's particularly enthusiastic. I would like her to share her opinion on what is her blue sky dream that this will become. Because I bet it's different from what everybody else is saying, but I think she's thought about it and she has an opinion on it. And whether I agree with that opinion or not, it'd be interesting to hear.
You know, I started off my career in the 90s as a study coordinator doing breast cancer trials, which is how I became a breast cancer doctor. And it is really not different than 1996.
Hasn't changed.
I would sit there, I got a laptop. Now the laptop was this big, and you would open it and you would take it from the paper records, you would put it into this, and then it went to 3 other places. And you were collecting so much data that, because there was this fear of, if I don't get the right piece of data, I'm not going to get the answer I need at the end. So let's collect every time this person sneezes. Let's how many times a day do they sneeze? And I'm not trying to make a joke about, because safety and rigorous clinical research is important, but that's the whole point of today. You're saying we're absolutely going to do rigorous clinical trials. We are going to see safety signals. We might even see them sooner and be able to see trends sooner than a whole bunch of people grabbing forms and putting them together and hoping someone gets to them and looks and says, oh, there's, interstitial lung disease, or we could have picked that up, earlier.
Yes.
I also think we're going to get to a point in oncology and in clinical research where we're going to start seeing the pre-signals. And we can't do that unless we have this technology, but we're saying, okay, we know this person, if they have X, Y, and Z, they're going to have a hospitalization in 15 days. That's where we're going. And this is the very first step.
I found this to be a very interesting comment, and something that I hadn't thought about, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So many years ago, there was a story about the retailer Target, and they were sending coupons for products that would be used by women who are pregnant to a home. And so the father in the house was like, well, what are you doing? Well, as it turns out, through their analytics, Target identified that it's very high probability that someone in that home was pregnant. And based on their purchases of like natal vitamins and lotions and things like that. And so this, as it turns out, the guy's daughter was pregnant and he didn't know it. Now she knew it, which is why her buying practices changed. But there are, if you analyze data carefully, you're going to find that. Now, I will say that her comment and her interest is really very patient care focused. How can we get an early sign that someone might have a problem 2 weeks down the road? I'm not sure that is fully in alignment with what a drug sponsor might care about, because they're looking for signals. Do we move forward with this drug or not? Or is the FDA going to allow us to move forward or not? So they're not unrelated, but it's not quite the same thing. But I did find that to be a super interesting comment.
People ask, what is a real-time clinical trial? It's where we, as FDA scientists, can see these endpoints or safety signals in the cloud as the trial is happening in real time, live. And so this is a new data feed that has the potential of making more efficient the massive data consolidation, analysis that goes into these giant applications, and just make it more efficient.
I know this isn't correct, but when he talks about it that way, I just see a bunch of FDA scientists sitting in a room with large monitors on the wall watching real-time data come in. It's kind of like a NASA type picture. And then one flash is red and, we have got a safety signal in trial 1, 2, 3. And, how many trials can one FDA scientist simultaneously monitor? What is the workflow in terms of the FDA for this real-time monitoring rather than just seeing the package at the end?
It's really a milestone. If you think about pandemic preparedness, this is a huge...
This would have been a game changer.
Don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we in our roles, we were responsible for creating strategy around clinical research during COVID. And it was a nightmare. We didn't have data systems. Yeah, I remember it. At 7 a.m., we had a early a.m. call. At 5 p.m., we had a p.m. call. We looked at all of the clinical data from all of the emergency rooms across the healthcare system, the ICUs, and we had spreadsheets. I mean, it was primitive. So even at that level, not even thinking about trying to collect data in a trial, not leveraging systems to look for signals. And I agree with you. I think we'll get early signals. So I think it's transformative. The other place where I think that can be a real game changer.
Okay. So they were talking about the pandemic there. I don't see how this idea of real-time clinical trials really is directly related to a pandemic. A pandemic, hopefully, is such an outlier event that using the idea of a pandemic as a selling point for this, oh yeah, we just did have a pandemic, it's fresh in everyone's minds. In the end, that's not really what this is for. This is about helping facilitate new drugs come on the market to the benefit of the public health. And it may have a use in pandemics, but I don't see why this is a big point of discussion.
Is while we need process innovation in how we do the trials, we also need process innovation in what is necessary to get a product to approval. And what we were talking about a little bit earlier today is that as you go through this process, I am pretty certain you're going to realize you ask for too much data. And that actually how the trials will be done will require less invasive testing on the patients, which will actually increase their ability to participate remotely, which will completely democratize the ability of rural and urban environments to be able to participate. We require for these RESIST criteria in oncology trials, MRIs done every 6 months, CAT scans done every 6 months.
Yeah.
So that's bringing your patients into the healthcare system. They don't need to be there.
Yeah.
So, keep in mind what her position is. She oversees a lot of clinical trial activity in the UPenn health system. So to run trials, if you need to have more invasive procedures, that does add a lot of cost. Not to make this about money, but it's a little bit about money. It also, if all the FDA cares about is overall society survivability or progression-free state in the disease, and she's got a point. Do we need to do all these other things to hit those endpoints?
So I really think that the utility of the information that you collect using this technology will not only help us execute our trials and industry design the trials, but also might help regulators reimagine what data points they need.
That's a great point. I mean, was one of the focuses, like the way in which this real-time cloud trial worked was that when we started it, we said, listen, send us over your protocol, right? Mm-hmm. And then what are we going to send back? We're going to send back what basically the reporting criteria, mm-hmm. right? When you do that at that early phase in the process, what you're forcing the FDA to do is to make a decision on what's important.
Yeah.
Okay, they are forcing the FDA to make a decision on what's important. And that's a pretty early decision in this overall process. I'm sure they are, but there have to be later checks on that decision. Were those early decisions based on limited data, maybe even more limited data, because they're talking about cutting down some of the preclinical safety information and IND information? Were those decisions fully informed, or do they need to be revisited? But there is a risk in making decisions early, especially, there go those lights, especially when you're acknowledging that this decision is now being forced.
Which actually gets to this point of like what do you really need to make a decision? And so when you have to make those judgment calls, right? It changes the calculus of what do I actually really need to know in this part of the process? What's the onus we're putting on, mm-hmm. And so that's one of the objectives of sort of the approach is to have the FDA work in concert with the sponsors to be like, let's think about what's necessary.
Minimum
necessary in order to get to a decision. That's because when you think about it, if you're kind of restart the process, that's where you start. Mm-hmm. You're like, okay, what's the bare minimum I need? Nothing more, right? And then over time, we'll build up certain. Okay, I needed that piece. I really would have liked, the narrative, a little bit of the narrative information around this event or something like that helps me quantify it. Okay, great. Or I wanted to have something additional around. An adverse event type or whatever it might be. Those are literally the conversations I had yesterday. Right.
I would like in the press conference they referred to the dashboard where all this information is shared, and I suspect the AI officer on the screen, did a lot of work helping design that dashboard. Having an image, a snapshot of the dashboard would really help people understand exactly what's being discussed, what's there, what's not there, and that would help people be able to follow along.
Right? When as the team seeing the data roll through, they're going, well, that's great. I need a couple extra fields here and here, and that should be all I really need for this section, right? And the same thing then they're saying is, what data can we use inside the FDA that we already have, right, to help inform us around what's going on? So I think this gets to an aspect where, the FDA traditionally has never really used all of its historical information and all of its previous data to help.
Very aware of that. Yes.
So.
Okay, so clearly all the data the FDA has. Well, the FDA holds the data, but there might be questions about how the FDA can use the data. Remember, all these data were collected under IRB protocols, and they specify how the data can be used. And so that doesn't mean that you can go back and look at those data. Maybe you can, but you're going to have to write another IRB protocol to specify exactly how you're going to use it. So, and why do we do this? In the name of protecting the participants in these studies. This is protecting the patient rights. So, it's not a small thing, but you can't just say, oh, we have all this data, you better let us use it. That can't be the attitude that is circulated here, because there are reasons those safeguards are in place. And who put them in place? The federal government put them in place. So, deal with it.
So this is a part of the process where, like, if give me the least amount of information I need up front to make a decision, but let me be empowered to use all the information that we sit on, that we have, in order to help drive, to help understand what's actually
empowered. The FDA wants to be empowered to use it. Listen, you're going to have to seek permission to use it, but you can't be given just a blanket power. And I suspect that the FDA would love that, and based on some of the responses in the room, other people at the table would love that. And I don't think we should romanticize what these data, historical data, medical data, tends to be notoriously fragmented and incomplete. So I'm sure there are valuable trends that can be teased out of there. But this isn't like airline travel data or weather data where you have all these nice data points. That's classic big data. This is going to be messy, incomplete data, and not even as clean as data you get from a clinical trial, which is really not that clean.
Actually happening here.
Yeah, it'll be. Sorry.
No. I was going to say, but do you see that then, where the whole traditional, if you do a study, you wait for it to report out, then you write the phase 2, then you wait for it to report out, then you could see where it's a single study with stop, go, no go, and we get quick answers from both, the sponsor in academia and the FDA, and it just triggers it without recontracting, without redoing it, and you write the one trial for the whole development with just the blanks of the couple places. So, I mean, the dead spaces that you were talking about, Commissioner, are long between trials, and we should be ready to roll with the next if we have that early signal that this one's going to change lives. The recovery.
It seems to me that she is advocating for not 3 phases, but really just one massive continuous trial. And it's pretty much exactly what she said. So just hold that thought a little bit.
Her trial was actually a great example of that.
Is that the steroid trial?
Yeah, during COVID. So it had multiple arms. And so the way it was designed, it was sort of like an adaptive trial design where you come into the study and the first 40 patients would be randomized to A, B, and then you would do an interim analysis. And then based on the safety signal, you'd say, no, we're going to stop here, or lack of efficacy signal. But the people who had a response would continue. Then you add another arm.
Yep.
And then you keep on adding arms. Now, while that was a very good design during a pandemic where you didn't have companies sort of competing you had less of the companies competing with each other, it still is a model approach to rapid acquisition of data that drives decisions, real-time decisions. Would I love to see us stop having phase 1, phase 1A, phase 1B, phase 2A, phase 2B, phase 3, another phase 3, phase 4? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because not only do I think it takes way too long, you don't get a lot of incremental information over that time.
Yep.
Okay, so again, there's another vote for, a single mega trial. Now I will say, they talk about getting data quickly. Not all diseases progress very quickly, where you can very quickly see changes. But of course, everybody at the table is talking in the context of oncology. So if this is something that works for oncology, that's great. But I haven't heard a lot of compelling arguments that this is something where every indication is going to benefit from this approach. But everybody's view at this table seems to be about oncology. It's kind of myopic in that way.
And you're describing the sort of gaps between.
Yes.
So obviously you're not saying we should not be doing clinical trials. What you're saying is the gaps between our dead time where we're doing.
Oh, you're not saying. Yeah, they are saying. They're saying, let's not do 1, 2, 3. It seems the commissioner is like, okay, we want change, but let's keep this in check.
And paperwork, we're doing stuff that we saw a statistic that I just mentioned. 45% of the time from the initiation of the phase 1 until the FDA final NDA or BLA application is dead time. That is, there's no ongoing clinical trial that's happening. So it makes, what you're describing makes all the sense in the world. It makes so much sense that sometimes you wonder if we can do it.
Why were we not doing it before?
When I think
Okay, I understand that these gaps look like a loss of productivity, and maybe they are. I'm not really disagreeing that, but let me just say something else. What if you're creating a drug and you have a study that has 3 arms, or maybe a 5 mg dose, 10 mgs and 15, and maybe the 5 is twice a day and the 10 is once per day and the 15 is once per day. And as you go through these studies, you find out, wow, we really think maybe a 12.5 mg dose it is the way to go, once a day, 12.5 mg dose. Well, you can't just immediately run that trial. You have to order those tablets. And, you got to negotiate with a contractor. They've got to make them. Maybe they don't have the tooling on hand, and so they have to equip themselves to make these 12 mg tablets. You then have to do quality assurance on those 12 mg tablets and make sure that they behave the same way as the other tablets and for absorption of this compound. That requires time. There are gaps sometimes that are required to simply get things going. Another example, sometimes you have long-term tox studies need to be completed. Those probably aren't done for phase 1 because those volunteers aren't taking the medication for long periods of time. But for phase 2, they're going to have a longer dosing period. All that preclinical tox work, which probably wasn't started until the drug actually went in the clinic, those have to be completed. Carcinogenicity studies have to be completed. Reproductive tox. So there's a lot of stuff that has to go on in the background that is not in the clinic. And sometimes you can't start things in the clinic until some of those pieces complete. So all the gaps are not just dead time and paperwork. They're completing required activities. Of course, if you're in oncology, many of those drugs are administered by infusion. It's relatively trivial to change the dose size if you're administering a drug by infusion. For oncology, you very often don't have to do long-term tox. So, it's when they're just looking at the world through the oncology lens, they're saying things that really aren't necessarily true for all aspects of drug development. But they're making it sound like, this is a waste. And it sounds very compelling, but it's not telling the full story, I don't think.
begs both, right? Why weren't you doing it before?
Right.
Why weren't we? It's really a collective responsibility. And if it's so intuitive that it should have been done, are we missing something along the way? And
Yeah, you are missing something because you're thinking everything's an oncology trial, and that's just not the case. Or a trial for using steroids during COVID. You know, that's pretty quick disease progression right there. So, yeah, I think there are things being left out of this conversation, and which is not a reason not to try new things, but understanding there may be a limitation in the scope of value for real-time clinical trials.
And I think you won't know that. The proof's going to be in the pudding of how you actually do it. And I also think that we don't actually know what the right answer is. You know, that this is going to be very much a learning process. You know, I don't even call it a pilot approach. I think this is an iterative process that as we go along, we won't necessarily stop to say, was that right or was that wrong? We'll actually just keep on reinventing as we go through the process.
You know, the irony is some U.S. centers refused to participate in the recovery trial because it didn't meet their elaborate study design, preconceived ideas. But in the end, maybe the intervention that saved the most lives in 2020 was the use of steroids in the ICU early. So noted.
You know, what I think is ironic is that he made that comment. You know, people not being flexible was probably reinforced by the FDA, by the FDA's own rigid practices. And now the FDA wants to change the rules, which I applaud. Let's explore some different things. But you can't retroactively criticize people for not being innovative when perhaps the FDA hasn't been that innovative historically. And you know, they can defend not being innovative. Hey, we don't want to change things too quickly in the name of patient protecting the public health. That's a valid statement.
I said 2020 to avoid the...
I know. I was going to challenge your company. Not a good idea to challenge the commissioner, but we'll leave it there.
So, are we going to add something, Jennifer?
Oh.
I didn't know if I cut you.
No, that's okay.
So, in 1747, James Lind did what may have been the first clinical trial for scurvy.
Yep.
And so, do you want to tell the story?
I do. I love.
Okay, tell you what, I'm going to do a little break here just to make sure my audio doesn't get messed up, but we'll come back with scurvy. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, I got my lights turned on as well. Let's keep going.
Love this story.
She didn't know I was going to say it, so that's she knows it.
I've actually challenged the date. I think that was the date that it was published.
I think you're right.
But the study was actually done earlier. This is such a neat study. So it was conducted amongst the British Navy. And they sent out, they knew that seamen were dying, but had no idea why. So this particular physician decided he would design the first ever clinical trial. He didn't know it was a clinical trial. And he randomized 12 sailors to 6 different interventions. Oh, I'm not going to remember all of them.
Vinegar,
salt water. There was something.
Salt water. I remember that.
If you go on Wikipedia goes through the 6 different groups, and it's very well written on Wikipedia.
Tastes disgusting.
And then one was citrus fruits, and they demonstrated that citrus fruits dramatically prevented the onset of scurvy, which was why the British Navy then became known as limeys.
Well, the Navy refused for many years to adopt the findings.
Yes, they did.
You know, they did what you see happens today in modern medicine, and that is you have a very powerful trial, and people find a way to nitpick it and ignore the results and write it off because they may not have liked the person who did the trial. But it was a classic example of how the dogma that it couldn't possibly be so, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about history, it really there were over 1 million people that died of scurvy. I mean, it was And tragically, it affected African slaves.
Yes, it did.
That came across. They would lose half the crew, half the individuals and passengers. And ironically, the cure was right in front of their eyes, but ignored for a long time. So there was that publication in 1747, famous trial showing the polio vaccine helped eradicate polio. And then today at the FDA, the first real-time clinical trial, thanks to all of you. So it's a historic day in clinical trial history.
Happy to be part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What did you think when you learned about this opportunity?
You know, I think that one of the worst things as an oncologist is when you have a drug that's showing promise, you've given it to patients in their, phase 1, and you have patients who have no other options, and this drug, but it's in the dead time. And it really matters. And these patients are holding on. They're waiting for us to write the trials. They're waiting for us to activate the trials. So every day that we hold on activating a trial or have it on hold to patient, it matters to real people.
Yeah. You think about some of these new drugs that are getting approved. Every day matters.
Oh, yeah.
You've seen that both in the.
Yeah.
What's your clinical area, by the way?
Cardiology.
Cardiology. What's that? Heart stuff?
Kinda.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you're good.
This side? Or this side?
This is really just kind of meandering at this point. I don't feel like there's a specific direction. Now, Emma Meagher, Dr. Meagher, she is, so she's in, her background's in cardiology. Cardiology, that's an indication where you potentially don't know for years down the road whether a patient or a patient population will have, after a treatment, have a reduced cardiovascular risk. Now, maybe you can follow certain biomarkers, and if they're surrogate endpoints, and that's okay. But cardiology, there's an area where it takes a long time to really suss out the benefit of the compound.
Magic.
Doesn't matter.
There's probably sits in the middle.
That's my kind of cardiologist right there. But you think about people who are, when you break bad news and you see people clamoring for any kind of hope. And sadly, I think we've all done this way too many times. And there's no textbook that prepares you for it. And it's always hard. It never gets easier. And you think about people who are just asking the question, is there anything humanly possible on Earth that can be done to live longer? And you start asking these questions, right, as somebody proximate to that, and you realize delays in the system have risks. They have risks.
Yeah.
Right? The risk is it may prevent somebody or delay somebody from getting a promising therapy.
Yeah, I think that's really real. I'll give you 2 concrete examples. First is baby KJ, right? Gene editing. I worked very closely with that team on getting that submission to the FDA and had the opportunity to meet the family. And they were holding on to threads. Now, that wasn't a clinical trial. It was a single patient treatment use. But that desperation, you see all the time. The second is that the way we write clinical trials is overly cautious. And I think this is in part because what are the reporting criteria? And so more often than not, we have patients who don't meet the eligibility criteria for trials, but we can't write the next trial until the data from the first trial is in there. Yeah. And that is exceptionally common, that you have patients in clinic and you really can't do anything for them because we're just too inefficient in what we're doing. And it's incredibly...
That's a big admission. We have patients in the clinic and we can't do anything for them.
Frustrating.
Yeah. I think this is one of the I was having a conversation. Someone asked me, like, how summarize, right, what you're trying to accomplish here. And I said, it's very simple. It's like aggressive vision, and we're going to iterate the implementation, right? We're going to do fast turns on this. We've already actually done this, with the data, with the initial, we send over our clinical.
He does talk like an AI Silicon Valley guy. I mean, that's his role. But that is how he sounds.
Trial reporting scheme that went out over to the sponsor, passed to the vendor. They were looking at it. They came back with some additional things that they wanted to add into it. Came back to us, made the updates back to them. We've done that like 3 times in just a couple of weeks. And so this idea of and then they're saying, hey, we think we want a new way of analyzing this specific criteria. And then the sponsor saying, hey, maybe we can do this. And the FDA team is like, maybe we can do this. So this is the pace and the sort of it gets everybody in the boat.
Yeah.
Not to make a pun on our previous conversation, but it gets everybody in the boat, right? That you're all working for the same objective, is to get to an answer as quickly as possible, and as safe and effective as possible. And that's what we're seeing is we're seeing all the different parties coming together. Because it can't be like, I think to accelerate this, to move it at the pace that we needed to move it for patients, we can't all just sit back and just say, well, it's not I'll wait for the other person to come in and do their part. I'll wait for the other person to come in and do their part. Or we had to mail it over. And we're waiting on a response, right? Like that's a horrible thing to say to patients, right? And so I think everyone has sort of if you're in this space, you have a moral obligation to sort of come in and everyone work together to try to get there as fast as possible.
It has to happen that way. You call it poking the balloon.
Yeah.
That if you don't look back and you're just, I'm going to fix this one spot at a time, you've stuck your finger in the balloon, but nothing changed.
Yeah.
Right? And that happens all too often. And this is why the FDA, academia, our sponsors, taking that 40,000 foot view, it's the only way it's going to work.
It is. It is. And that's what I've seen definitely in this process was that everybody coming together, is what's really sort of driving and different people are coming up with different ideas. And I think the goal now is there's 2 parts I'd love to sort of see, right? From industry, from academia, from all these sponsors to say, okay, the FDA said we can move, right? It's carte blanche, let's go, right? Like, and not just, you talk about process improvement, not just on just the trial part, right? We touched on other areas of the process as well, right? Where else can you work with sponsors and your different engagement mechanisms to say this is taking too long?
How much time do you have?
Okay. I think that's a great point. So maybe I've kind of harped on this thing. It's all about oncology. Maybe the real-time clinical trials are more of a fix for indications like oncology. There are probably multiple indications that also would greatly benefit from, maybe all, but maybe just some. But as they look at the entire process, they are finding other efficiencies that will help other indications as well, which does help to get, not every drug sponsor is in the oncology space. So that gets more buy-in from more potential stakeholders. And the more buy-in you get, the more ideas you get on the table and the more everybody's going to benefit. So that's a good point. It's not just about, the grand vision is not just about real-time clinical trials. The grand vision is let's make the entire process better for everybody. The people at the table, sponsors, patients as well. And of course the American public.
Lots of ideas on that one. And not only sponsors, but you mentioned earlier the IND submission process.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There's and I would make a point here that I think you will always find academia to be a willing partner, in part because there's very much a mutual benefit. We are on the front line treating the patients. And so there's this kind of added incentive for us to do right by the patient. And that's not to say that pharma isn't also motivated by good, but if you're not actually in the trenches. So one thing that will drive the ultimate success of this innovation is that pharma really buys into it, right? So when we submit INDs to the...
There is an implication here that drug sponsors are dragging their feet in this process. And maybe they are. I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised. UPenn, their healthcare system, their business model is in part running clinical trials. So, of course, they're pro faster, more clinical trials, keeping the United States. How come the sponsors don't want all this? Well, the sponsor's business model is selling drugs. And to do that, they need approval. Now, clinical trials are part of getting a drug into the FDA approval process, filing an NDA. But drug sponsors, they understand the current process. They know what the risks are. They know where potential pitfalls are. And they've studied how to navigate that process. When you say, hey, we want to completely change this process, now I think drug sponsors it's very fair for them to say, how's this work? Is this good for us or bad for us? Is our approval rate going to go down? It's already pretty low. Is it going to go down further? That will affect their business of selling drugs. So I understand why sponsors may not be buying in immediately and jumping into this. Whereas academia, and I wouldn't say that's really academia, that is the healthcare system is like, yeah, let's go. The US healthcare system is all aboard for this. I know UPenn is part of University of Pennsylvania, but I don't consider that to be academia in the broad sense. That's the healthcare industry.
FDA. Pharma either submits them. It's a classic industry-funded, industry-sponsored trial, which is big business, really complicated, really difficult.
Do not be fooled. Academic research hospitals are big business. That's undeniable. Don't make this about business against the purity of academia. That's not what this is about, or it shouldn't be what it's about. And that's not a way to get sponsors to buy in either.
Mm-hmm. And then you have these really innovative discoveries that are done under research INDs. Yep. They still result in products. Penn has 55 of them.
Yep.
And when we go through that process, our ability to partner with the FDA, life-changing.
Yes.
CAR T-cell, we couldn't have done that if the FDA wasn't a partner. CRISPR, we couldn't have done it if the FDA wasn't a partner. So really making sure that industry holds up its bit, academia holds up it really has to be a sustained partnership to make it work.
CAR T, again, we're talking about the oncology space here.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the IND process, because we have been deep in the IND phase 1 world for the last year, and hopefully we'll have pretty soon some pretty powerful announcements to make about reforming that process, because we're losing our competitive edge internationally, and we've got to modernize and streamline that process to focus on safety. And we can focus on safety and reduce a lot of the onerous requirements or defer them. Mm-hmm. And so we have a massive endeavor. One thing that we've learned is that sponsors will submit a lot of information that we don't need for the IND. That is the stuff that they perceive we want, but we don't want it, or at least we don't want it at that point. We can look at it later, or we don't need it, along the lines of the 66 million page application that FDA had received. But there's this arms race where they perceive, hey, let's just send everything, every printout of every side test and study. And sometimes we don't set clear guidance on what we require and don't require, or we say what we do require, and then it's a gray area, and they're sort of doing guesswork. Do we want this additional information? So we have talked about making it very clear on the FDA website what you do not need to submit for different stages. Okay. For an IND, you do not need to submit X, Y, and Z. And so maybe that explicit
clarity. It will help. It will absolutely help.
So the FDA does not provide explicit instructions, and then sponsors get mocked for including too much information. Yeah, put some instructions on the website. Give people some guidance. It's common sense.
If you look at the difference between an IND submitted by an academic institution versus an IND submitted by industry, they're night and day.
They're night and day.
They go through the same.
A research IND and a commercial IND are night and day because they are not the same thing. Of course they're night and day.
Review process.
And it's like half of the INDs are academic, I would say, something like that.
Yes, they are. Yeah. So, if the FDA is willing to approve it based on that volume of data, there's definitely room for improvement there, and look forward to that. That's wonderful.
We've got to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it gets to the point where you mentioned, like, as opposed to poking a part of the balloon, there's been a big focus here around the whole thing, right? And you think about it from the pre-IND to IND to now what we announced today was the real-time trials.
Yep.
To the filing review, right? Which we'll get down to a day until it's almost there.
Instead of 2 months.
Instead of 2 months, right? It's like, I mean, it made sense when you had to bring in all the paper, lay it all out.
Yeah.
It creates a paper right? Before have someone walk around with a checklist, make sure you got everything before you actually sit.
They're laughing at a paper submission. Of course there was paper submission. I mean, it's okay.
Hey, you're good to go on the review. And then you actually look at that and then you think about the review, which is now done in, that demonstrated through the commissioner's, priority voucher program down to 44 days, 50 days, less than 60 days. So you look at that, right? And I think the point is you couldn't just focus on one thing, right? And you had to look at the whole thing, right? And it gets down to the process improvement side. It's like what's been done. And so we've been doing this, I think, and we've been hitting each part of the process, each part of this. I like, it's like, I don't know if laying siege to it is the right term, but it's been like something where you're working on each part at the same time, right? And I think what people are starting to realize is that was done with purpose, with focus, with energy to actually get to these outcomes which we're at today, right?
Jeremy, what's next for real-time clinical trials?
Sure. I think, what's next is we're going to go from what we built was a proof of concept, and we demonstrated that this is entirely possible working live. So now we want to scale that. Right, so that goes from a proof of concept into sort of what we'll call a pilot program. We had the RFI announced today, so we're looking forward to sort of industry's feedback around everything that's going to be involved and what they want to, and just in general what their thoughts are, right? So we look forward to receiving all those responses. Then from there we'll launch sort of the pilot program. I'm not going to sort of say this is the final selection. I think we're teetering between 10 and 15 sort of trials that we're looking for. But that'll come out in the final sort of pilot announcement. And the goal there is to look, and we're focused, I think, our initial thinking is to focus on those early phases, those phase ones, those early phase twos. What can we do to sort of get that information over in real time, get up to our reviewers so that they can make a regulatory decision, that they can help say we can move this forward, or this has got some concerns and we need to have a deeper look at that. I think that's where we go next, as we go into the and then from there it's you take the successes of that, and to your point, Emma, iterate it. Just keep iterating it until we get it refined and good, and then it becomes an operational capability.
Hey, okay, so the future looks like 10 to 15 trials. And my guess is they already know what those 10 to 15 are. And they're just deciding which ones they're going to move forward with and which ones they aren't. But it could be as many as 15. I would hope that when they look at those 10 to 15 trials, they don't look for the ones that they know will succeed. I hope they look for ones where they feel this might stress the idea of a real-time clinical trial. Put some duds in there so that you actually get information about when does the current design of a real-time clinical trial work and when does it not. But sometimes people cherry pick things because they know they're going to be a success. And so yes, you can crow about your successes, but as a learning process, you really don't learn that much about how the process actually works in the wild.
So one suggestion.
Yeah.
Include 1 or 2 academic INDs in your group of 9.
It's already been suggested.
I listen, I don't know what's going on here, but I would guess that since that question was asked, probably there aren't INDs from that particular research center. I don't know. That's maybe a little overstepping for me, but that's my guess. If you got to ask, the answer's probably already no. But the FDA has already kind of handpicked what they're going to work with.
Surprise, surprise.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have a menu for you.
250 of them.
I think we are excited about this. The biggest thing of my concern is, can we scale it? Can we move as fast as we want to move? Right. Yeah. I think that the desire to move faster is now that we've shown it's possible. Right. I think the question is how do we institutionalize that, and how do we make it part of the process?
Yeah.
And so
willing industry partnership is essential.
Yeah.
You get
again, industry's not doing enough here. Well, they're footing the bill for the most part, for at least the commercial INDs.
One or two on board. They're quite competitive amongst each other. The onus was to bring the others.
I have no idea what you're talking about. We've never heard of it.
No.
So if you're out there in the world listening right now, you're probably saying, what a beautiful campus. And I would love to come work at the FDA. And the good news is we are hiring thousands of scientists. So good observation. Number two, you're probably saying, I can't wait to get to the RFI and read it and provide public comment. Thank you very much. And number three, you might be saying, how do I participate in a real-time clinical trial? And that's coming. That'll be in the formal pilot.
Yep.
After we get through this proof of concept phase this summer.
Yep.
Is that the plan this summer?
Yeah, I think end of spring, early summer would be kind of our goal.
After the public comment period.
Yep.
You know, so we want input along the entire process, and we want it from everybody.
Yep.
And so that's good. So it seems like this is a first step. This towards continuous trials, towards bigger things, towards reducing what we call the white space, that is the time between clinical trials, where 45% of the time in a drug development is now white space. But this is not the silver bullet, the real-time trial. This is a step towards bigger thinking, but
I want to say something about his comment about white space. When I hear people talk about white space, I tend to think about people writing code. If you write code and don't properly use your white space, your code becomes almost impenetrable. There's in the C language, there's an obfuscated C competition. Who can write the most impenetrable C code? And one of the things people do is they take out all the white space. It just becomes unintelligible to anybody who's really good at, unless you're really good at coding. And so white space does serve a purpose. And I'm not saying maybe they don't need two spaces after a period, but it still does serve a purpose.
hopefully it is letting people know, and it's sending a signal that we're willing to be as creative as we can be while ensuring public safety.
Yep.
So that's why your perspectives are so valuable in this process. Yeah.
I love the concept of partnership. I mean, it feels different, it feels like we can do, and it's not just this piece, right? It's applying data science tools to real world evidence, synthetic data, how we collect data in trial from wearables. Yeah, there's lots of reform that can happen throughout the entire process. So it's exciting because you kind of feel if you have a win in one corner, you get to move down the pike.
And it's accepting trials. We can't do the trials of 1995 anymore, over and over and over again. And we have, for the first time in my career, really, I have patients where the new drugs are outpacing their metastatic disease. When I think of these patients with HER2 positive or hormone receptor positive, and now even triple negative breast cancer, it's happening so fast. And it's happening so fast that even when you do a phase 3 randomized clinical trial, the comparator arm is out of date by the time you even start putting those patients on the trial. So we're now thinking, how are we going to rethink how we do trials? I have now 3 drugs.
Okay, she I think has made 2 fantastic points, and one of them was right there. This oncology has received so much attention, since the kinase inhibitors since Gleevec around 2000. It has just spurred so much research into oncology, and new drugs are coming out quickly. And there was a recent trial with a GSK drug, Blenrep, that was last summer. Their AdCom meeting was on YouTube, and they were voted down in the scientific advisory committee because their treatments were not relevant to standard of care. And my impression was it's because during the time of the trial, the treatment landscape had changed on them. And they were held accountable. Now they ended up getting approval, but for a narrower indication than for which they were applying. Yesterday, April 30th, 2026, AstraZeneca had an oncology drug that also had, they got voted down in the AdCom meeting, and they were called into question about the relevance of their comparator arms. This is a real problem. And so the time frame of approvals, the approvals are coming out so fast that anything you do today could be obsolete once it's under review for approval tomorrow. So this is a real challenge, and especially in a dynamic landscape like oncology.
Bugs that dropped in the exact same spot, and I don't know what's the best for my patient. We're going to have to rethink how we do trials, how we get quick, kill bad drugs quickly and move on to the next one. And I think just like the trial you were talking about, we have to start thinking outside of the box and get answers faster. Yeah, I agree.
Did you have experience with people enrolling in the real-time clinical trial to be able to say that this got them energized, they were all excited, they were interested, or was this something that was at a clinical level where you weren't directly part of the consent and didn't have that feedback?
So the trial we did at MD Anderson was in a different disease site, so I did not personally do it. It was in lymphoma. But our Michael Wong has led it, and he's been doing an amazing job.
Okay.
I can tell you from the experience for the AstraZeneca mantle cell lymphoma trial, there's a learning curve. It's not naturally intuitive. And so taking the time to train the people in the trenches as to how you actually make the connection. The technologies are both excellent, but you've got to create the APIs between clinical pipe and the EHR, and then you've got to train the staff on, so that there's bits in there that there will be a learning curve.
Okay, so she talked about the interface. This isn't the dashboard maybe that the FDA sees, but who dumps the data in there? Well, it's the people who are the patient care professionals, and they have to put in the right information so that it all gets spit out to the FDA the way they want it. So this is a change, and it's academia or research hospitals may be enthusiastic to partner, but they're feeling there are some pain points on their end too. Just think about the sponsors. I think they have a bigger challenge.
Management.
Yeah, for sure. The one thing I will say is in our conversations with the team, the PI was totally on, the physician, totally on board. Anything that could keep their CRC in their row for a month longer. The
physician's on board, but the physician isn't doing all that legwork. So here's a real issue. If the clinical trial sites are not able to do a good job, then that's going to lead to problems for the sponsor once you start coming up for approval. So if that all doesn't work pretty well, then as a sponsor, you might say, I don't want to do it at a U.S. site, because if I do it at a U.S. site, I'm going to have to deal with FDA wanting to do real-time clinical trials. I'd rather go somewhere else. So they better make sure that they don't innovate themselves and in the process alienate the sponsors and force them to go overseas and take all that sweet clinical trial money out of the country and somewhere else.
CRCs and the project managers and the regulatory people are anything that changes how we currently do it, we're willing to try.
Okay, great.
So I really, when I say the proof is in the pudding, we just need a little bit more experience, and there will be bugs in the process in trying to get it executed.
There will be bugs. That's not what a sponsor wants to hear. But let's not kid ourselves. There are already bugs. Okay, the current system, as she just attested, the current system is not perfect. So the new system does not have to be perfect. Doesn't have to be perfect for the sponsor, but it's got to be good enough that everybody feels comfortable participating.
But the willingness and the enthusiasm to do things differently is there. The timing couldn't be better. Yeah.
The why is strong.
Yeah.
I think that the great thing is that the technology components are all there now, right? I don't know if they were there, like they weren't all there 10 years ago.
Oh, they were not there.
They weren't there 10 years. There were pieces, right?
Yeah.
Like now, there is no technical limitation. There's no reason that this cannot be done, that we cannot scale the analysis of data, at site, with the criteria that the FDA says we need to hear about. Right? There's no way there's no reason that this can't be done. And so I think from this one, the real-time clinical trials, is as much a process change, right? But it's we're saying we're going to move we want to move at an exceptional speed here. We're going to leverage the latest technologies to do it. There's no technical limitation, so let's clean up the process and let's fix that.
Okay, let's make a little cut there. Okay, good. Let's get right back into it.
There's an access issue whereby you can actually expand access to clinical trials in this program, as you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah,
Explain the rationale.
Well, I think there's number one, there's the speed issue. So being able to get more people on if you can run more of a continuous trial, right? So there's access there. Mm-hmm. There's the amazing work that's done at the medical centers that you both are part of. But there's also expanding things out into the community and rural settings too.
Yeah.
Where there's a need. I think the numbers are like 70% of most people live within about 2 hours of a medical center, right? So that you can cover a large portion. But that's 30% that isn't covered by that, right? So looking at technical solutions that you can still onboard people in rural settings, where they don't have that immediate access, getting industry to be able to sort of collect the real time data that's happening in those more rural environments. That opens up a huge portion of people.
I don't think it's just related to this technology.
Yeah.
The one thing that COVID showed us when we had to shut down everything, we continued to do research remotely.
Yep.
And the regulations were all modified to allow that to happen. Now they've kind of crept back in there a little bit, but I know they will be changed back. But the ability to leverage telehealth for research purposes is enormous. And we should be doing that all over the place. The ability to ship medication across state lines, that should be easy.
Yes.
Currently isn't. Our ability to take blood pressure recordings off, your Ring or your Apple Watch, and to incorporate that data into the EHR, that's technologically possible.
Yes.
Your EHR is your electronic health record. So how to gather data, and so she's talking about this would be automatically logged. You don't have to have someone do the data entry, and that was really a pain point in her discussion about the staff having to get everything entered right. Well, if it can be automatically logged, that saves a step.
Just don't incorporate it. So there's so many technology solutions that we need a concentrated commitment on the part of the regulator accepting that data, the pharmaceutical company agreeing to that change, because that's a big culture, and then academia making it happen. Yeah. We implement what pharma wants us to do.
Well, and that's a fair point. Hey, my Apple Watch, which of course I don't have, my Apple Watch allows me to collect all this information. Well, is an Apple Watch an approved medical device? And maybe the FDA or maybe major pharma says if it's not an approved medical device, then we're not going to count those data. Because, some of that wearable technology, it's kind of borderline quality. And what if I'm a patient? I don't have an Apple Watch, but I have a Temu watch. Well, maybe how do you decide all this? There are questions.
I think from it's like that blood pressure one. It's an interesting one. If you've got someone in a remote setting and you can stream their blood pressure information back to you, right? Under the real-time clinical trial approach, as long as you're analyzing that data, you can send a signal on me if you're seeing blood pressure. If that's part of the reporting criteria for that specific trial, you could send that signal to me. But I don't necessarily need to see the data, right? So the idea that you have to collect and process and manage all that data is not necessarily a requirement of what we're thinking about from the real-time clinical trial aspect. Mm-hmm. So there's an aspect too of normally you'd have to get all that data, so get all that real-world evidence data, and then eventually try to stream that or submit that to the FDA, where we would then receive that.
Yeah.
It's not,
makes sense.
It's the goal is to sort of say if we trust that you're analyzing the data correctly, right? You can get a stream as much information. You just tell us what you're using as that, and you can send us you send us the signal. But it kind of changes the focus, and it like puts the innovation piece back into your lane, right, and back into your side to say, I can collect and grab as much information as I want as part of this trial, and if I don't have to end up collecting all that and providing it to the FDA, what does that mean to how quickly I can?
Okay. It's easy for the FDA to say that because they're the gatekeeper. But here's the concern. Remember that early decision? Everybody made the decision. Here's what the FDA needs. How reliable is that decision? Because there's going to be a fear that the FDA is going to come back later and say, you know what? You gave us X, but now we want X and Y. And if you haven't been collecting that, what are you going to do? Repeat the whole trial? So the clinical trials, they're going to collect data. The sponsors are going to say, well, they might change their mind. So if that early decision is something everybody can agree to, that's the deal, then sure, you can collect less. But trials are unpredictable. Every drug is different. So you have to build in some contingency. And the FDA can't really have the attitude, well, we only asked for this, so it ought to be simple for you. Yeah, but that one signal is not the patient. You can't reduce the patient to that one signal. So they're going to collect more. Of course they are. And it's right for them to be concerned about that. Even if the FDA says, well, we only want this one signal. Well, healthcare is not a single signal. In this case, maybe the approval is simpler than the healthcare piece.
This is the mindless collection of data for an unknown purpose. And your 6,000 or 660,000
pages, 6 million.
There you go.
66 million.
I just can't imagine even reading.
I mean, most are like
no one did.
200,000.
Crazy.
Sometimes collecting more data is good for trial centers. They get paid for diagnostics and things. So it may be that the trial centers want to collect more data because that is their business model in part.
It's the time of a patient too. Why do we need this many EKGs in this time?
That's a huge.
I've never seen anyone make a major change based on these 8 time points within the same day, and the patient's running up and down. And I think that your guidance on decentralized trials have been really helpful as we really think through hard IRB questions of who really needs to be on the 1572. No, you can see your regular doctor near your home who does a history and physical as part of their routine scope of care. And we can ask these questions and not make people come out of work, 3 times a week when they don't need to. And I think even that, and the proof will be in the pudding again, is that getting drugs to the endpoint by using those trial structures, I think once we get our first one there, it will be a floodgate, and it'll be the best thing for patients.
Swear.
There they go, making sense again. Way too logical. Okay, final question. How is the food at your hospitals? You serving ultra-processed food or real food?
No, real food.
Good.
Yeah, interestingly enough, so Penn is one of those campuses that just keeps on building, right? They have buildings. So as long as you go to the newest building, you get the healthy choices. If you go to the old building, bangers and mash. Here we go. But the newer buildings, it's good. And I think it's a strategic investment in healthy living, that the food is I'm going to say, by reputation, is really good. I've never eaten at work, so I can't really tell you.
Are you NPO all day or what?
Pretty much, yeah.
How about an MD Anderson?
Not NPO all day. I think that there's been a very active move to move into, healthier eating. They've changed many of our cafeteria choices. We now have healthy options in vending machines that are in every building. So so at any point of the day, you can go and get a healthy salad or and not have to go and sandwiches.
Okay, not just ding dongs without.
Not ding dongs. Hard. Yes.
Well, that's important. It's a big initiative. In this.
No, it is a big it is a big initiative, and I would say it's actually a big area of scientific study at Penn. Is the whole thing around healthy food choices and advertising, and how we actually play an incredibly important role in how we portray the foods that we eat. And so,
We've seen the work of Kevin Volp.
Yeah.
And so we're eager to see some of that trial data readout.
Yeah, there's more coming out. It's a really neat study, which is a perfect example of what you're trying to use. So he uses this platform called Way to Health that they built at Penn, and that they use it to collect food inventories of patients living throughout the urban areas, which cover very large socio-demographic groups, and cardiovascular outcomes, obesity outcomes, and diabetes outcomes.
A real-time food trial.
Real-time food trial. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. But prospective. I'm not sure I'd call it a trial because there's no intervention.
Single arm,
observational, prospective, real time. Yeah.
But it's real because we are seeing, we're definitely seeing younger onsets of cancer, and we think that's related to a lot of these issues and the processed foods. But we are really spending we're spending a lot of time digging into where we shouldn't, because we're deep into the microbiome.
Yeah, good.
And
dang. Her third great point here, an insightful point that really, I think, has complete clinical relevance. The microbiome, huge topic, poorly understood, hard for big data to get at because it's so darn noisy. And it's going to really take a huge amount of data to tease those signals out of this. But fascinating field.
That is, we are just finding out so much there, and how it affects your immune system in fighting cancer, how different drugs work differently based on what's in your GI system, and it all comes back to the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So you are with
something you wrote a lot about.
I thought we were wrapping it up. It's good stuff. I mean, microbiome is, in my opinion, the great frontier organ system in the body that we know the least about, that we should know more about. And when you look at increasing rates of GI malignancies in people under age 50, and that plus liver cancer, which you could argue liver is part of the GI tract, those are the cancers increasing as the other cancers are decreasing, generally speaking. So how could it not have something to do with the interface of what's directly proximate to the GI tract? And when you look at some of these intriguing studies that are observational, and you cannot derive sweeping conclusions, but in JAMA surgery, a study looking at the association between colon cancer in young people and C-section delivery. What do we know about C-section delivery? You have a different microbiome by C-section delivery. Now, C-sections save lives, and sometimes you need to have a C-section, but these are sort of big questions where now the door is opening, and we're starting to realize there's a lot there that we don't know that we should know. Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
More work for the scientists.
More work for your researchers and more grants. So
what?
More grants. You dangle more grants in front of an academic. He's lucky he didn't lose a finger doing that. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Historic day at the FDA, and it's an honor to share it with both of you. So
as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Good to be with you. We'll do it again. Thanks.
That was a banger. It really was. I do like the informal banter. Seeing scientists talk with other scientists about challenging problems. That is a real privilege. So thank you to the FDA for sharing this content. Thank you for your attention, and please take care.